This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about books and research and other things that we like. And if you like ours, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You will get exclusive subscriber-only content. For example, most recently, an interview with Itai Ater, professor of economics at Tel Aviv University, who discusses his new study into the radically new patterns of emigration of Israelis out of Israel in the last few years, or an interview with Sina Azodi, professor of Middle East politics at George Washington University, about his book, Iran and the Bomb. Just go to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Look for the big button that says Patreon, click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. My guest today is a historian, a fellow in Israel studies at the University of Calgary in Canada. He's the author of two books, the most recent of which is Embodying the Revolution, the Hebrew Experience and the Globalization of Modern Sports in Interwar Palestine, which was just published in English by Rutgers University Press. Dr. Ofer Idels, hello and welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
Shalom Gilad, glad to be here.
So by way of introduction, maybe you can start by telling us what you mean by modern sports generally, and more specifically, what is your object of inquiry in the context of pre-state Israel, i.e. interwar Palestine?
Yes. So, we're talking today as both the World Cup is in order, just arriving to the knockout stages, which are the most interesting phases. And also yesterday, the Maccabiah also started. So we're in a very sporting summer that happens one of few years. But I think that most people, we're kind of accustomed to sport. It's part of our culture, part of our society, and we're very much taking it for granted as something that just there. Even when we are talking about like the history of sports in a popular discussion, we usually can say it goes all the way back to ancient Greece and the ancient Olympics, like something that was always there with us. But perhaps the most basic assumptions of sport history in general, as a subfield that's developing from like mid-70s or for at least, is that modern sport, as it says, as its name, it's a modern phenomenon, meaning a new phenomenon. Indeed, both the World Cup, it's a pretty new event, as much as like the first one is just almost 100 years ago in 1930. So it's pretty much a new phenomenon. And we can start to define what exactly modern sport is, but its basic core is competition. And when we are going to and trying to understand the history of it, we can see it's starting to develop in the end or the mid-19th century in Britain, moving to the British Empire. But just in the interwar years, after the First World War, where internationalism become much a more prominent phenomenon, nationalism become a much more prominent phenomenon, mass culture become a much prominent phenomenon, modern sports become a much more of a globalized phenomenon.
Institutionalized, perhaps?
Institutionalized, both by FIFA and the International Olympic Committee, which were established before the interwar period, but just in the interwar periods become like the mass representations or the main bodies that basically control and adjust sports.
So would you say that modern sports is yet another vessel for collectivity, whether national or not?
In part, definitely. I said it, we're taking it for granted, but the point is that it's one of its qualities, we can say, as a cultural phenomenon. It can be representing many stuff. Both you can find it in masculinity, you can find social values in it, which for capitalism, competitiveness or not, obviously cultural phenomenon, nationality, internationality, and the list goes on until universal ideas like fair play and whatever.
So in the case of Zionism, so it was just natural that as the Jewish collectivity was taking shape, they would find expression also in modern sports.
Yeah. So I think I mentioned the chronology because I think that's the key. Because if we're thinking of sport as a new phenomenon, something that in the interwar period, meaning the 20s and the 30s, was starting to appear as in the world stage as something that is vital, something you can no longer ignore as like a mere British phenomenon that happens and is a mass cultural phenomenon. You also have debates about it. Do I want to do it? Is it the right thing to do? Does it produce healthy citizens that I want? Does it produce the healthy, the disciplined citizens that I want? And go on and with any, is it even fun? Is it enjoyable? Okay? And indeed, in those times, we have those discussions all over the world. In each place, in the different context, of course, of this specific place. You have this new phenomenon, you can no longer ignore it. Very much, you can say, compare it in some weird comparison to AI, for example. Suddenly you have it. You have a new phenomenon you can no longer ignore. So in each context, it's each place have its own debates about it. And also in pre-state Israel, the Yishuv, Jewish community in mandatory Palestine, whatever you want to call this community in place. But definitely there, where it's itself an emerging community, we're trying to define and decide for itself its personality, its ideas, its goals, its culture. Those debates have specific meanings, and that's basically what my book is about.
Exactly. So I want to go into the debates in a second, but before that, just to end the introductory bit, quite often Jewish physicality in the context of Zionism is attributed to Max Nordau's muscular Judaism, which is a speech that he gave in 1906, was it, or thereabouts, in the very beginning of the 20th century, that seeks to, among other things, reinvent the Jew as a physical entity or a personality. Your take is slightly different, and I would like you to explain why.
Yeah, my pleasure. That's why I'm here.
Yeah.
Yes, so if we go back to sports history or the history of physical culture in modernity, we see there are two main outputs. The English one, or the British one, which we now just call sports. And the second one was the German one, or the Central European one, which is called Turnen in German, or just gymnastics. Again, it's a very modern phenomenon. It's the middle class, but it's very different or juxtaposed to sport in that it's not competitiveness. It's basically doing the drills we know from gymnastics in the Olympics, but not in a sports way, not in a competitive way. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that when you're trying to transform gymnastics into sports, you get this weird scoring card that no one can understand by home, because it's not meant to, you're not meant to give a score when someone does the pull-ups and all of those flip-flops and whatever. Never mind, that's a side note. But they have two different perspectives about what's the modern body we should develop by physical education. One is sport, which is very much centered about competitiveness, which we can also say is gently capitalism, because it's come from Britain. And there's another one which is much more entanglement with the life reform movement, or the idea to try to create a balanced, holistic body and more national, perhaps, or different kind of German nationality. So in the eyes of gymnastics leaders or advocates, modern competitive sport is literally not healthy, because its competitiveness, it's mean extreme, it's mean radicalness. So it doesn't develop the body or the mind German sees as ideal. And indeed, Max Nordau, as someone who was grown in Central Europe, is advocate for gymnastics. For him, Jews need to do gymnastics, build their own clubs for gymnastics, because Jews are not allowed in the German gymnastics club, and trying to develop their mind and body through gymnastics. Meaning that people who followed Max Nordau, including Maccabi leaders in Palestine, which is emerging during the second Aliyah, meaning the early 20th century, are advocates of gymnastics. For them, gymnastics and not sport is the platform from which we should create the new Jew.
So when did the transformation occur?
And that's basically the start of the book. That's also the first chapter. they're starting as a gymnastics movement, and very, the second Aliyah, the First World War, and then we're getting to the 20s and the 30s, and now gymnastics is on the decline almost everywhere, and modern sports is on the rise. So
Because of the entertainment value of it?
that's a good question. I don't think the study gave a very concrete answer. It's a very problem or a very you need a very
contentious.
yeah, because it's very hard to say what exactly passes through the eyes of people where like suddenly they found something enjoyable and now not enjoyable. But yeah, definitely it's much more entertainment. Yeah, you get a lot of like also financial incentive because you can sell tickets, so it gives a lot of like incentive to develop this phenomenon for people. But yes, if you've opened Hebrew newspapers, like newspapers from a lot of places, you'll find major debates about should we invest in gymnastics or in sports? Do we have a choice to develop maybe? And there's a lot of people who says in Hebrew, from Maccabi, or advocates of gymnastics who said to us, no, this sport is just extreme. It doesn't develop the right body. It doesn't develop the right mind. It's not fit for Zionism like gymnastics is supposed to fit. And some of them even think, oh, this is just going to be a short-time phenomenon of modern sport, and very quickly people will return to gymnastics. History had other plans, of course, but in the 20s and even the 30s, or at least the mid-30s, it still seemed like it's something contentious or at least debatable that people should translate. But yeah, in order to understand, we need to first acknowledge that sport is not an ahistorical phenomenon, basically, and it also has its own concrete history, which in Hebrew is a little bit...
But it seems that at this time that the Yishuv, or effectively the Zionist movement, is coming together and gaining shape, that this thing is manifestly non-ideological, that it is sort of a separate realm from the nation-building process and settling the land and all the things, even inventing Hebrew culture, all the things that Zionism is so associated with. Yet, as the title of your book suggests, embodying the revolution, the ideology, and that sort of frivolous entertainment are tied together.
Definitely. So yes, that's basically, I could say, the main historiographical contribution of the book is that, like, I think for several decades now, when scholars or historians are thinking about Zionism and are thinking about the issue, so they have this idea of the pioneers or the labor Zionism or several other groups who are, again, as you said, are in their settlements in the Galil or whatever, and they build their settlements, and very, I'm making it a little bit simplistic perhaps, but in Tel Aviv we got the urban people who live a very a cosmopolitan life or based on well-being, bourgeois, yeah, and it's like. And it's supposedly not Zionism. And I think what the book is trying to challenge, push against, is that these ideas of Zionism, the ability to create a new Jew and the ability to live as a sovereign subject or to create Hebrew culture, to live in Hebrew, for example, were part of life of Jews at this period everywhere, basically. They appeared in very different scenarios, very different interpretations. It was definitely far from monolithic. It was very much diverse. But the question of, I'm a Jew who lived here in this sovereign society in Hebrew culture, was not something people ignored or just put aside to their life. It was very much the meaning and the center of people's lives, even when it comes to phenomenon like sports or gymnastics or whatever.
So would you say that really ideology was inescapable at the time, even if you really wanted to turn your eyes and do whatever it is that you wanted to do that is not considered political or ideological? Still, it was?
Yes. I can follow here very various scholars of ideology, and by saying ideology never, even today, is never inescapable. We just have a different ideology. We can debate what our contemporary ideology is.
By the way, my favorite definition of ideology is Terry Eagleton's, who says that it's like bad breath, right?
Yeah.
It's always something that other person has, not you.
Yeah.
Anyway, carry on. Sorry.
We're also living in an ideology. We're living in a time where ideology seems like a bad word, but everyone has it, just a different one.
But is it just the benefit of hindsight, of you as a historian who looks at these people and say, okay, obviously they were ideological because ideology was inescapable? Or were they aware of that themselves in real time?
When you go back to the sources, okay, and a lot of it is newspapers. But again, it's sport newspapers. It's like the Maccabi newspaper, which is not exactly mass publication, but like a journal, basically, with its members. Even go to letters or schools pamphlets. Or, you can see that when they talk about sports, and by that also talk about the meaning and the meaning of body and mind, they keep mentioning and keep not even arguing, but discussing the meaning of Zionism if you're doing that. So I don't think it's something I think that's something they lived through. Again, not trying to escape, but definitely something that was part of their life. They're there in this so-called weird society where suddenly people speak in Hebrew, among other language, but suddenly speaking Hebrew. It's very much ideological. It's very much radical. It's very much something that people are aware of. Okay, it's not another society. And it's something people have interest in it, and something that people care about and think about as part of their life.
So it's sort of like an atmospheric influence, just people by virtue of being here, speaking Hebrew, living in the land of Israel, that whether they like it or not makes them part of the Zionist project.
Definitely.
And I'm wondering, to what extent is it different from other Jewish political projects that were not Zionist? Because the Bund, for example, the famous diasporic movement in Europe, also during more or less the same period, also had their own sports association.
Yeah.
How do you how do you compare the two?
So it's actually interesting because, again, the Bund started an Eastern European, which was more influenced than Central European. In that perspective, they, like the people in the Yishuv, had a very much early, if we can even say, contempt with competitive sports, and I emphasize the competitiveness of it. And very similar chronology, of course, in that only in the mid-30s or so, they become much more inclined to be more supportive of it or trying to accept it, again, just because it's part of the time. You can no longer ignore it. So in terms of sports chronology, actually the Bund is quite similar to that of Zionism. The big difference, or perhaps the one difference, is that what happens pretty quickly, and perhaps jumping ahead a little bit, is that in the Yishuv, when the pioneer become, again, very early on, the main Zionist ethos of Zionism, the main platform from which we can create this new Jew, okay, the main ideal for it, so we can create a new Jew. Sports has starting to become associated with diaspora Jew. It's kind of like an activity you should do in the diaspora, or at least have a very different meaning in the diaspora.
Because it's frivolous and it's not like contributing to the nation building the way you want it to do?
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly because of that. Of course, there's of course the different context.
So why didn't they revert back to gymnastics and to Nordau's ideal of...
Some people tried, or at least hoped for, but... And I think that's the point, the most delicate point, perhaps, of the arguments of the book, is that, like, you're always living in the world, and you cannot go revert the world or adjust it completely. You have to always react and counter-react to the world, and sport is the world in the 20s and the 30s. You cannot go back to using, Nokia phones, although both of us use them in some part of our life, and we cannot go back to horses or whatever. So you're living in the world, and your wish is not necessarily...
I wonder, now that you mentioned the difference between Eastern Europe and Palestine, to what extent did the British play a role in this? They were the ruling power in this country. They brought some of their customs and habits, obviously not as much as other places in the world. I don't think, you tell me whether cricket was anything to be reckoned with in Palestine at the time, as much as it was in India and other places. But to what extent is like the British ethos of sports? You said that it started in Britain. It was a British thing for a long time. Yeah. Did they play a contributing role?
Yes. So thank you. That's actually a very good example. So yes, of course, the British comes here in the early 20s, and they also contributed to developing sports. For them, is in their goal for modernization. So sport is a great tool. It's their tool, and it's a great thing to have. And of course, they have a contributed effect. However, and this is why sports history understanding it's key. Because in the early 20s, or and definitely in the early 30s, or just the 30s, sport is no longer a British phenomenon. That's basically the transformation of the 20s and the 30s, is the becoming of sport as an international phenomenon controlled by International Olympic Committee and FIFA, the same organization that are still with us and controlling the sports world. And indeed, already in the early 20s, you can see people of Maccabi right here from Palestine, writing to the FIFA in order to get a first recognition from FIFA and the International Olympic Committee, and also about rules and stuff. So they understand the authority of what they're trying to do is coming from not from the British Empire, but like from some international order, and that's basically the meaning, the reason that cricket or rugby or all the places that are in all the games that are still today very much popular in countries that were part of the British Empire, like India, like Australia, are not part of Israeli sport culture basically at all.
Nor were they ever.
Nor are they ever. I guess that like there was perhaps teams here or there, but it was never like in India, for example, where when one of the indigenous people play rugby, he's basically playing with the tension between his identity and the British identity and the empire identity, and all of those tensions we find very clearly in places. So yeah, my guess is that if the British were, from some magical reason or whatever, appeared in Palestine 50 years before, we're still playing rugby today, or cricket or whatever. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that was not the case.
Yeah, it's just a question of timing, really.
Exactly.
Yeah. I have a more methodological question here, because what you're basically trying to do here with your understanding of Zionism is really trying to, I don't know, broaden the concept a little in the terms, especially in its understanding today. Zionism, for good reason, is perceived mainly as a political project, and you focus here on the cultural aspects of it, which is something that is not revolutionary. It's, I mean, for a long time, Zionism was seen as a cultural revolution, no less than a political project. But also after 1948, when the political project was sort of completed, and also, several generations of Israelis, Zionist children were born and brought up. So you could say that the cultural aspect of Zionism has, slowed down a little, perhaps lost some of its elan. But I'm wondering, like today, you are based in North America. You published this book with Rutgers University Press. You give talks to American people. You also weigh in on issues and current affairs. How well does it go down to try to tell people what your concept of Zionism is? Do you feel that it comes as a surprise to people these days? Do you feel like it's some sort of like an uphill struggle? Tell me a little about that.
Okay, so thank you. A lot to unpack here. So I'll start with the basic frame. The book first basic question is a very Israeli question. It's like, why Israelis think or they're not good at sport, or really not doing in sport, but it's something for Israeli is very common. It's very intuitive that we're not good in sport for some reason, okay? So the book is basically trying to understand that, or trying to develop or why this notion came to be. And it goes all back to history, basically going back to the origins of Zionism, and trying to understand contemporary Israeli culture, or some motives from Israeli culture as related to Zionism, which again is, even in Israeli culture, is not something necessarily taken for granted, because we are very acquaintance with our own culture. We're taking it for granted. We're not feeling it necessarily in relations to this concept of Zionism, from both sides of the political spectrum, by the way. And I will definitely try to push back against that, and saying that like this thing called Zionism is very much with us in a cultural way, in our identity, in how Israelis perceive the world. And again, not necessarily in a political perspective about what you should do with the West Bank or the Palestinians or Gaza or in Lebanon and so forth and so forth. Again, in how we perceive our world, what is the meaning to be an Israeli? So I think in that perspective,
but also, I mean, there is a certain connection, or at least like an articulating link between the cultural project and the political project. Also, in your book, in the chapter that deals with physicality and militarism, of how like what the cultural realm that you're talking about with relation to physical culture and sport was indeed translated into, you know, the political ends of the project.
Of course, they are connected, but to this day, Israeli culture, if we're gonna like it or not, are developing. People who can go to the army, having the privilege to live both in Germany and in Canada. This is very much different than the atmosphere and what other societies are growing up and developing, and definitely the IDF and the military apparatus of Israel is playing also a major cultural part in Israel. So yes, things obviously are related, but again, I will try to add like an asterisk to it and say it's not the whole story. Yeah, you cannot tell.
How so?
Because relations to language, culture, what's the meaning of being an Israeli? How you perceive the world, okay? What you can do and not do, okay? It's a very cliche and common example, but I'll use it anyway. There is a reason Israelis don't stand in line, okay? Or don't stand in line. It's related to something like how they perceive time and space and so forth. And they are less polite and more direct and drive in a different way. And we can go on and with many more examples like that, better or worse, but I don't think our entire existence or entire meaning or identity can be summed up into like the conflict.
Okay. Ofer Idels, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing to our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has way more than 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and on Blue Sky as well. But most important, join us again next time for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.